Hi all, welcome to CodAffection. This is the fourth video in this series of explaining user authentication and authorization using ASP.NET Core Identity within a Web API project. In the first video, we have discussed how to create a user within ASP.NET Core Identity. In the second video, we have discussed how to implement user authentication with JSON Web Token. And in the last video, we have discussed how to organize everything inside the program.cs file. Now in this video, we'll be discussing all about authorization in ASP.NET Core Identity. If you haven't watched the previous videos, I strongly recommend you to watch that first before watching this. Links are given in video description. So without further ado, let's get started. Now let's start with comparing the process of authentication and authorization. Authentication verifies whether a user is an insider or not. Now, the process authorization grants access to protected resource only if the user has necessary permission. We have already discussed authentication in great depth and implemented the same in the second last video. Now, this video is dedicated to authorization. Now, you could see the same comparison inside the official documentation. Authentication is the process of determining a user's identity, while authorization is the process of determining whether a user has access to a resource. Like we have seen, during the process of authentication, the user will be making a post request with their own login credentials. And then the identity management solution will check whether there is a user with the given credentials or not. So that's the process of determining a user's identity. Now each user inside the system will be allocated with different roles or different permissions. Now in order to access a protected resource, the user must have the necessary permissions that the protected resource is asking for. So based on whether the user has the necessary permissions or not, authorization will grant or deny the request to access the protected resource. Now let's see them in action. Now we can divide Web API methods into three categories based on how we apply the authorization to them. So first of all, we have Web API methods that does not need any type of authorization. For example, consider the endpoints like user registration or sign-in. All of these should be open to anyone without any authorization criteria. And then we have the second category of Web API methods asking the basic or minimal criteria for authorization. That is, the user must be authenticated to the system. In case of JSON Web Token authentication, in order to access these types of Web API methods, the user must pass a valid JSON Web Token. So this authorization is asking for the minimal or basic criteria. For example, consider a getWebAPI method to retrieve user profile data. This endpoint should be accessible to any authenticated user. And then any Web API method asking authorization criteria, anything extra from being authenticated to the system, comes under this third category of Web API methods. So the criteria will include role, claim, and policy. We'll be discussing them in great depth. So first of all, I'm going to make a getWebAPI method for user profile, and it should be accessible to anyone authenticated to the system. So back to Visual Studio. First of all, I'm going to create a C# file for account endpoints. Now, like we have discussed in previous video, let's change this class into static. Now, let me add an extension method like we have done inside this identity user endpoints. Let me copy this and pasting the same here. Let's rename this method to map account endpoints. We have already discussed these best practices in previous video. Now we're going to make a get request, so we can invoke this method map get, and the corresponding endpoint will be like this, user profile. Now we can handle this request inside this private method get user profile. So here is the method private static get user profile. For now, from this method, we'll only return this string user profile. So let's change the return type of this method to string. Now in order to register this endpoint to this Web API project, we have to invoke this method from this program.cs file. So here we go. So here we have a getWebAPI method user profile. From that we are returning this string user profile. Now, in order to restrict this Web API method to the authenticated user, we can invoke this method require authorization, or we can apply this authorize attribute. authorize attribute can be applied to the method that is handling the request. Let me build this project. Back to the API Explorer. So here we have the new get web API method user profile. Now if you try to access this web API method, you will get this error for node 1 unauthorized, meaning that you are not passing the minimum criteria for authorization that is being authenticated to the system. So along with making this get request here, we have to pass the JSON web token that we get from sign-in operation or login operation. So first of all, let's sign in into the application. We have already created a user with these email and password, email@gmail.com. Then the password was string, then followed by #simple. Let's make the request. So here we have successfully authenticated to the system. As a result of that, we got the JSON web token. Let me copy paste the same into Notepad. Now along with making a get request for this user profile, we have to pass this JSON web token. Remember this illustration from our second last video? Just now we have created a login operation and we got a JSON web token. Now we're going to make a request for accessing a protected resource. So inside the authorization header, we have to pass the JSON web token like this that we have just received. Upon reaching the request at the server side, it will validate the JSON web token, which we have already discussed in our second last video, explaining how much safe is a JSON web token. And we have already configured how this token validation is to be done while adding the authentication service. So inside this extension method, we call this method add authentication, and while invoking this method add JWT bearer, we have configured how we want to validate the JSON web token. And here we have specified what are the schemas that we are using for different handlers inside the identity solution. If there are multiple schemes involved in the process of authentication and authorization, you can set them separately like this. Since all of the handlers inside this project is managed by JWT scheme, we only need to pass the JWT scheme here instead of this lambda expression here. JWT bearer defaults.authentication scheme. Now here we have specified that we don't want to save the token inside the server once the token is generated. And through this token validation parameters, we have specified how we want to validate the JSON web token once it reaches the server as part of accessing a protected resource. So of course, we want to validate the token signature, and for that here we have given the secret key. Now along with this, I forgot to disable the validation of token issuer and token audience. So I will set this validate issuer as false and then validate audience. To explain in simple terms, while creating the JSON web token inside the sign-in operation here we have only passed the user ID. Along with that, we can pass the issuer, meaning the URL of this web API from which we have created the JSON web token, and the audience, meaning the URLs of the client-side applications. So if you want to make sure the issuer or audience that you have passed inside the JSON web token is the inside the received JSON web token here, you can set this validate issuer and validate audience to true. By default, these boolean properties is having the value true, so that's why we have set it as false here. Now it's time to make the HTTP request to access the protected resource. Along with the request authorization header, we have to pass the JSON web token. For that, if you have an API Explorer other than Swagger, then the process of making the GET request will be much easy. Let me show you how it is done. At present, we are not passing the JSON web token, so let me make the GET request again. Now, let me copy this URL. At present, inside my system, I already have the API Explorer Postman. From that, we can make the request like this. We need a GET request, and here is the corresponding URL. Inside this authorization header, we can set this bearer token. Then inside this text box, just pass the token that we have received. Let me copy this and pasting the same here. Send the request. Boom. We got the success response containing the string that we have sent from the web API method here. Now if you want to see what's happening behind the scene while making this request, you can open this code panel here, just expand it. See, while making the GET request inside the header, authorization header, the token is passed here. As a prefix, we have this bearer, just like what we have mentioned here. The same syntax should be used while passing the JSON web token inside the authorization header. You can achieve the same if you have installed the VS Code extension Thunder client. Let's make a GET request, and here is the URL. Inside this auth header, we will select this bearer and we can just paste the token that we have received. Send the request, boom. Now coming back to our Swagger API Explorer, we don't have a direct way to modify the request header. If you want to achieve the same, we have to do the necessary configuration while adding the Swagger API Explorer inside the project, which we have done inside this extension method. We have to pass the necessary configuration inside this method add Swagger gen. For now, I will just copy paste the configuration that we need for sending the bearer token. So here we go. Here we have the lambda expression with this options parameter. You can copy paste this from our GitHub repository. Let me build this. Now inside the API Explorer, you could see this option for adding the bearer token. So first of all, we have defined a security definition with the name bearer. Inside that, we have set inside the authorization header, we want to pass the bearer token for JWT authentication. And for all the Web API methods, we have given a security requirement for the bearer token. And that's the reason why along with all of these endpoints, you could see this log icon. So that's all about configuring the Swagger API Explorer for passing the JSON web token. I'm not getting into the detailed explanation. We are not focusing on Swagger API Explorer. You can just copy paste this code from our GitHub repo. So from now onwards, in order to access any protected resource, first you have to set the bearer token inside this text box here. So let me copy this JSON web token and pasting the same here. Click on Authorize. That's it. From now onwards, for all the requests, the authorization header will be set with the token like we have seen here. Now let's try to make the GET request. Boom. That's it. See how the JSON web token is passed inside the authorization header. So far we have discussed how to deal with the second category of Web API methods. Now in any given Web API project, most of the Web API methods will come under this category. That is Web API method asking the minimum criteria that user must be at least authenticated to the system. So in order to avoid repeating this authorize attribute, we will apply this authorize attribute globally across all the Web API methods. Let me show you how it is done. For that, back to the program.cs file. Here we have already added the authentication service into the project by invoking this method add authentication. Now along with that, we have to add the services for authorization. So here we go, services.add authorization. Now in order to set this authorize attribute globally across the Web API, we can have this lambda expression with this parameter options. All we have to do is just define a fallback policy. You could think of policy as a criteria. Into that, we have to assign an instance of authorization policy builder. Along with that, in order to set the authentication scheme, we have to invoke this method add authentication schemes. Inside that, we can pass the JWT bearer scheme. JWT bearer defaults authentication scheme. And for all the Web API methods, we are asking for the user to be authenticated to the system. Require authenticated user. And we have to finally call this method build. Sorry, we forgot to wrap everything inside curly brackets like this. Now with this statement added here, for all the Web API methods, we have set the requirement that the user must be authenticated to the system in order to access any Web API method from this project. But there will be Web API methods like sign-in or user registration. They must be accessible to non-authenticated users. For that, we can make use of this allow anonymous attribute. So let's see how the Web API methods are responding with this statement added here. Let's build this project. Now, by the way, for each rebuild we do inside the Visual Studio, this Swagger UI will get reloaded and the previous JWT token that we have provided inside this authorization header will be lost. So at present, along with any of the requests, there is no token passed inside the authorization header. Now let's see whether we can make the post request for user login or user registration. See, we got the error for node 1 unauthorized. It's all because of this statement adding authorization attribute to all the WebAPI methods. Now let's see how to make WebAPI methods accessible for unauthenticated users. Inside this identity endpoints, we have WebAPI methods for user registration and sign-in. In order to make them accessible for unauthenticated user, along with this method invocation, we can change this method invocation allow anonymous, or you can make use of this attribute allow anonymous. For this entire series, I will stick with attributes instead of methods. So let me remove this and let's copy paste the same attribute for this sign in method also. Build the project. Let's make the request again. See, we are not getting the previous unauthorized error. Now we have to deal with this third type of WebAPI methods. Before getting into that, I want to show you how to retrieve the claims of a signed in user. For example, inside this application, we have already created this getWebAPI method for user profile. Let's discuss how to retrieve the signed in user claims and how we can make use of them. Inside the sign in operation, we have added the payload containing the claims of the user. For example, at present we only have this claim for user ID. As a result of successful authentication, we have passed the JSON token back to the column. And then from there onwards, we will pass the JSON web token to access any protected resource, like we have done with the getWebAPI method for user profile. Now inside the user profile, we want to know how to retrieve the claim that we have added to the JSON web token during the successful authentication process. Now that's the job of auth middlewares. Now like we have already discussed, when we make a request for accessing a protected resource along with JWT token inside the authorization header, before the request reach its destination, the auth middleware will verify whether this JSON web token is a valid token or not, based on what we have configured while adding the authentication middleware. Whatever we have given inside this token validation parameters will be taken into consideration for validating the token like we have already discussed. And when the JSON web token is successfully verified, the auth middlewares will decrypt or unpack the JSON web token into claims principal. Remember, while creating the JSON web token, we have passed the claims inside the JSON web token payload. During the process of verifying the JSON web token, the reverse will be happening. From the JSON web token payload, the claims will be populated with the corresponding values. So in order to access the authenticated user claims inside this user profile web method, we can make use of this claims principal. Now in order to access the same claims principal, we just need to add this parameter here, claims principal. I will name it as user. So the value of this claims principal instance will be injected through dependency injection because of the service that we have added here. Along with adding the authentication services, here we have added the authorization services. It will add a dependency injection for the claims principal. And that's how we are able to access this claims principal inside this WebAPI method. Now we can retrieve the user ID that we have added into the JSON web token during the successful authentication. So here we go. I'll create this variable user ID. Let's access the claims property from the user object. It's an enumerable collection of the claims that we have added to the token. From that we can invoke this method first, and here we have the lambda expression to filter the user ID. X type is equal to user ID. Make sure to pass the same name that we have given while adding the same into the token. And we want to retrieve the value of the claim. Now instead of returning this dummy string here, I want to return the user profile details with the user ID that we have retrieved here. For that, we can make use of the user manager, which is of the type app user. I will name it as user manager. So here we go, user details. From user manager, we can invoke this method find by ID async. Inside that we can pass the user ID that we have retrieved from the claims principal. Since we have an async method here, let's prefix it with this keyword avoid. At the same time, this async keyword will be added to this method here. So we want to change the return type of this method as task iResult. Now let's return the user details inside the response. Results.ok. From that we want to return an object like this. Email is equal to user details dot email. There is a possibility that this user details is null, so I will add this question mark here. Let me duplicate this. Now let's retrieve full name. Let's build this project. Back to the API Explorer. First of all, we have to add the JSON web token into this text box that I will copy paste from this notepad. Now let's make the GET request for user profile. Boom. So that's how to retrieve and make use of the claims of an authenticated user. Now we can discuss the third type of web API methods. Apart from authenticated to the system, these web API methods have criteria defined with role, claim and policy. Now to discuss the rest of the topic of this video, consider we are creating a web API project for an educational organization. So first of all, we have role. Most often, the organizational designation will be treated as the role. No need to explain much. In whatever organization you are, your role or your designation determines your permissions, your responsibility in the organization. So conventionally, ASP.NET Core Identity Framework has been treating role as a different property to be considered for authorization purpose. Now considering the example project, we could have the roles like admin, teacher, student, etc. And then we have claim. You could think of them as pieces of information about the user. So any information other than the role will be treated as a claim. For example, user ID, which we have already added to the JSON web token, then age, gender, then the class or grade in which the student is studying, then library ID, etc. And finally, we should be familiar with the term policy. You could think of them as a criteria defined with role, claim, and when we want to combine roles and claims, there will be a logic in between them to connect each other. For example, admin only means only the user with the admin role can access the particular web API method. Then we have admin or teacher, female teachers only. All of these policies will be defined and corresponding web API methods will also be created in rest of this video. So without further ado, let's get into it. So first of all, let's look into this user table columns. We have user ID, user name, email, then password, phone number, then full name, which we have added through the app users model here. And rest of these columns are created corresponding to the default properties from this identity user model. Now we have to add columns corresponding to these claims here. And along with that, we have to add the role. As I already told you, the ASP.NET Core Identity Framework already treated role as a different entity inside the identity framework. As a result of that, inside the DB, you could see a separate table for roles. Into that, I will directly add the roles that we have seen here: admin, teacher, and student. In a real-world project, you will be having web API methods to implement the correct operations over the entity role. But in order to save the time, I will directly add the roles into this SQL Server table. So here we go. First of all, we have admin. Inside the normalized name, just enter the capitalized version of role name. Then we have teacher. Finally, student. Now I will show you how to assign these roles to the users that we create during the user registration process. Before that, Let me add the properties corresponding to these claims here: age, gender, and library ID. For that, I will modify this model for app user. First of all, we have the property corresponding to the gender. Then we have date of birth, from which we can calculate the age. And finally, we have the library ID. Now, in order to add the respective column into the SQL Server table users, we have to do the migration. So first of all, let's build this project and make sure there is no error. We have a successful build. So open the package manager console. Let's do the migration. Add migration. I will name the migration like added gender, date of birth, and library ID. Finally, we have to execute this command, update database. Back to the DB, refresh the tables. Let's expand this ASP.NET users columns, date of birth, gender, and library ID. Inside this table, we already have 2 users added from previous tutorials. Now for better clarity, I would like to remove those rows here. So here we go. Delete from the table. Execute. That's it. Now let's update the user registration web API method accordingly. So here we have the method to handle the post request for the user registration process. First of all, let's change this model to receive the data that we send through the post request. User registration model. Into that, I want to add these properties: role, gender, age, and library ID. For the sake of explaining this topic, instead of using the date property for date of birth, I have used age. Okay. Now inside the method create user, let's feed the data into respective SQL Server tables. As you already know, there is no property for role inside the user table. So if we want to assign a role from this table rows into a user from this table users, we have this table user roles. The corresponding user ID will be added to this column user ID, and the corresponding role will be added to this column. I will show you how it is done from the web API part, and then we can see how it is added in the respective table. For that, after creating the user, we can assign the role like this. It's an async operation, so I will prefix it with this keyword avoid. From this user manager, we can invoke this method add to role async. As a first argument, we can pass the user object that we used for creating the user. Second parameter should be the role that we want to assign to this user, that we can retrieve from the user registration model role. Now, in order to work with roles, we should add the respective services into this project. Along with adding the handles and stores, here we have added the entity framework stores. So let's add the services related to roles. Here we have to specify the model that we use for roles. We are using the default model from the identity, that will be identity role. For user, the default entity is identity user, but we have customized it into app user. But for the entity role, we have not made any customization, so we'll use the default entity from the identity framework. Now back to the user registration web API method. So this will assign the role passed to this web API method for the newly created user. Now in order to feed the data for rest of the properties while creating this user object here, we can assign the properties like we have done for other properties here. Gender from gender. Now for the property date of birth, from the current date we are minusing the years as much as age we pass to the web API method. And finally, we have assigned the library ID like this. So this is all the modification we need for the rest of the discussion. Now I'm going to create different users having different values of role and claims. To make the process even more simpler, I'm going to add a JSON file to this project folder directory. Add new item, and I will select this template for JSON file. Let it be user details. Inside that, I will paste an array of objects corresponding to the users that we want to create, so that it would be easy for you to do the same what I am doing here. So first of all, here we have a user with the role admin, and rest of the details are here. Now build the project. Let me copy this object back to the API Explorer, and here we have the post web API method for sign up, For the user we are about to create, there is no library ID. So rest of the properties will be like this. Now click on execute. Boom, that's it. So here we have successfully created the user, and you should see the same in the respective SQL Server tables. First of all, we have the users table. So here we have the new user, and inside this user rows, you should see the admin role added to the new user. See, here we have the user ID for the newly created user ending with C28, and we have assigned the admin role for this user. So this role ID should be the ID of the admin role inside this rows table. See? So that's how this table users rows connect both the entities user and role. Now like this, we have to add rest of the users. So to save time, I will pause the recording of this video and I will be inserting rest of these users here. Now finally, I'm done with adding all the users. Let's re-execute the select query for users. So in total, we have added 7 users. Now instead of selecting all the columns, let's select only the columns that we really care about. Let's execute the select query again. Let me order the result based on the column full name. From these users' full name and email address, you could know what is their role, what is their gender, what is their age, all of that. So at present, we have 1 admin, 2 teachers, 1 female teacher and 1 male teacher, and 4 students. 2 male students and 2 female students, and out of which only 2 students is having library ID. If you check the user roles table, you could see that all the users are assigned with respective roles. Now you know what we have to do. When any of these users get authenticated to the system, we have to save these information, role and claims into the JSON Web Token payload. Then only these informations will be available for defining authorization criteria. Remember, when a user successfully authenticated to the system, we generate the JSON Web Token. And all the necessary information should be added to the JSON Web Token payload. So whenever we try to access a protected resource with the JSON Web Token, during the process of validating the token will be decrypted or unpacked into the claims principal. And whatever we have inside this claims principal can be used for defining the authorization criteria. So back to Visual Studio, let's update the sign-in endpoint. Inside the method with these 2 statements, we will find and assign the user into this user object if there is a user with the given email and password. Now inside this if clause, we have all the details of the user from this users table. And along with that, we need the role assigned to the particular user. For that, we can do this. We'll have this object roles, and we can invoke this method get roles async from user manager. Inside that, we just need to pass the user object. Since we have an async method, just prefix the invocation with this avoid keyword. Now like we have added this user ID claim, we need to add few more claims. So what I'm going to do is, I will just cut this and I'm going to assign the same into a variable of the type claims identity as claims. Now we can add the necessary claim. First of all, we have gender, then age that I will calculate from the date of birth. And finally, we have to add the role of the user. Instead of using a string as a key for the claim, we have to pass this role property from the claims type. And here we have assigned the role that we have retrieved here. Now along with these claims, I also want to add the library ID as a claim. Not everyone has a library membership. So I'm going to do this. If the user has a library ID, we can add the corresponding claim into the payload. So here we go, claims.add claim. Inside that, we can provide an instance of the claim like we have done here. Library ID. From the user, we have to assign the property library ID. While defining this model property here inside the app user itself, you could see that we have defined it as nullable. And for the same reason, you could see this green squiggly line here saying that This property is nullable, so you cannot expect always a value from this property. Since we have added this if clause here, we can ensure that this claim will be allocated with a proper value. So in order to ignore this warning, all we have to do is, as a suffix, we can add this exclamation mark. That's it. Now we can pass this claims identity object claims into this subject here. Let's build this project. Back to the API Explorer. Let's try to log in with a user that we have just created. For that, I will make use of this JSON file, userdetails.json. We only need to copy this email address because this much portion of the email address is given as the password for all the users inside this collection. So here we go. So this is the admin user and here is the password. Let's make the request. Boom. Let me copy the token. Now let's go to the official website for JWT authentication and just paste the same inside the debugger. We have already discussed how to make use of this interface for debugger in the second last video. Just paste the token here so that you could see what's the inside the payload. See, we have all the claims that we have added from the login WebAPI method. User ID, gender, age, role, etc. So all of these are available inside the claims principle to define the criteria for authorization. Now what I'm going to do is I will just copy this JSON web token and I will add the same along with this object here. I will add a new property called token and let's save the token that we have got with a successful authentication for the user here. It would be helpful to test the WebAPI methods that we are about to create. Now let's see how the payload of the user having the library ID. Let's copy the email address. Here we have the email address and here is the password. Let's make the request. Here is the token. Let's copy this and pasting the same inside this debugger. Boom. Along with other claims, you could see the library ID here. Now let's copy this token and let's append the same to the respective object here. Now like we have added these two tokens for these two users, let me do the same for rest of the users also. It will be necessary for testing the configuration of authorization in various WebAPI methods. So a successful token for every user is added into this JSON file here. Now in order to define authorization criteria with role, claim and policy, I'm going to create a new C# class file for demo endpoints. I will name it as Authorization Demo Endpoints. Let's change this class into static. Now let me copy paste this method for map endpoints. Let's rename this method to map authorization demo endpoints. Let's invoke this method inside this program.cs file. Now let's see how to define a WebAPI method accessible only for the users having the admin role. So here we go. We have an endpoint admin only. I will handle this request inside this method admin only. And let's define the method here. For now, from this method, we are only returning this string admin only. Now, if you want to restrict this WebAPI method only users having the role admin, you can do this. First of all, we want to add this authorize attribute. Into that, as an argument, we can pass the criteria like this: role is equal to admin. So whenever a user tries to access this endpoint, the middleware will verify the user has an admin role, else the request will be denied. Let's build this project and let's test the new endpoint. For that, first of all, I'm going to use the JWT token of a student. Copy it and back to the API Explorer and let's paste the same here. So here we have the new WebAPI method that we have just added. API/admin only. Let's make the request. Boom. We got the error 403 forbidden. Do you remember when you tried to access the second type of WebAPI method here, if you are not authenticated to the system, the response status code was 401, meaning unauthenticated, meaning that you don't even have a JSON web token. Now we got a server response with the status code 403, meaning that you are authenticated to the system, but you don't have the required permission to access the WebAPI method. Let me show you that once again. Just clear the JSON web token and just try to access the WebAPI method again. See, this time we got 401. So that's how the status code works. Now let me try to pretend as a user having the role admin. So that will be the JSON web token of the first user. Let me copy this and let's set it as the bearer token. Let's make the request again. Boom, we got the status code 200, meaning everything went successful. And here we have the proper response from the WebAPI method. Next we have to check whether the user is having either admin role or teacher role. So here we go. Let me copy paste this endpoint. The corresponding route will be something like this: admin or teacher. Instead of defining a separate private method here, I'm gonna make use of a lambda expression like this. For now, we will just return this string admin or teacher. Now, like we have defined the authorization criteria here, we can add the attribute authorize. Along with admin users, we also need to consider users having the role teacher. That's it. Sorry, instead of adding the authorize attribute here, we just have to give it here as a prefix to this lambda expression. So that's how we can define authorization criteria using only roles. Now, if you want to make use of claims or a combination of claim and role, you have to define a policy, meaning a separate criteria should be defined inside the project. That we can do while adding the authorization service. Along with defining this fallback policy, we can define policies like this. Options dot add policy method can be called. Now let me define a policy with this name has library ID. So this is the name of the policy. And as a second parameter, we can pass the condition or criteria with a lambda expression with this parameter policy. All we have to do is we just need to check whether there is a claim library ID. As you already know, inside the users that we have created, there are users without a library membership. So we want to check whether the user is having the claim library ID. We can check that by invoking this method require claim. So we will check whether the user has the claim library ID. Make sure that the same name is used while saving the same into the JSON web token inside this sign-in method here. Library ID. Make no mistake, the same should be provided here. So here we have created a policy or criteria called has library ID. Now we can make use of it while defining authorization criteria. To save time, I will just copy paste the WebAPI method here. So here we have the URL of the WebAPI method library members only. As the name suggests, this WebAPI method should only be accessible for users having the library ID. So here we have given the authorization criteria with the policy that we have just created, has library ID. Let's build this project. Now let me copy a token of a user having no library ID. Back to the API Explorer, just set it as the bearer token. Since we have defined the method with lambda expression, you could see them under the name of the project, which is Auth API. So here is the newly created WebAPI method API/library members only. Click on try it out and let's make the request. See, we got the error 403 forbidden because the current user does not have a library ID. Now let's try the same with a user having library ID. Send the request. Boom. We got the status code 200 and we got the proper response from the WebAPI method. Now in order to create WebAPI methods having these requirements, let me add few more policies. Let me copy this and pasting the same below. I will name this policy as females only. So instead of checking whether there is a claim gender or not, we want to check whether the claim gender is having the value female. For that, as a first parameter, we can pass the name of the claim, and then as a second parameter, we can pass the value that we want inside the gender claim. Okay, female. Now along with the gender value female, if you also want to consider other values for this claim, for this criteria, we can pass them one by one after the female value here, like gender 1, gender 2, so on. Okay. Now finally, let me define one more policy for users having the age under 10. So I will name the policy as under 10. In order to define this criteria, we want to check whether the age of the user is less than 10. The comparison cannot be done with these methods here. For that, we'll make use of this method require assertion. Inside that, we can pass a callback method with this lambda expression having the parameter context. Inside this context, we have this object user. Inside that, we have the claims, which is corresponding to the claims that we have added into the JSON web token. From that, we want to check the value of the claim age. So here we go. X time is equal to age, and from that we want to retrieve the value. In order to convert this same into an integer, we can wrap this entire property with this method invocation int32.parse. So this much portion will give us the integer. Now we want to check whether it is less than 10. So here we go. So these are the policies that we need for defining WebAPI methods having these authorization criteria. So let me save this and back to this demo endpoints. Now here we have the get WebAPI method for applying maternity leave, and it is only applicable to female teachers only. Inside this authorize attribute, first of all, we have set the requirement that this is only for users having the role teacher, and they also must satisfy this policy females only. So this is how we can combine roles or policy or claims for defining authorization criteria. Let me build this project and let me copy the JSON web token of a teacher, male teacher, and let's set the same as the bearer token here. Let's try to apply for maternity leave. See, we got the error forbidden. Now let's try the same pretending we are a female teacher. So here is the user. Let's copy this token and let's provide it here. Let's make the request again. Boom. Now finally, I want to define a WebAPI method for females under 10. So here we go. Under 10 females. For that, we have used two policies. Policy under 10. So the user must be having the age under 10 as per the policy that we have created here. This policy. And along with that, the user must be having the policy females only. So when we apply authorize attribute separately with the policies, both the condition must be satisfied. So only female users having the age under 10 can access this WebAPI method. Build the project. Let's pretend to be a user having age under 10 but he is male. See, student male having age 9. Let's copy this token. Back to the API Explorer. Let's set the bearer token and let's make the request. See, we got the error forbidden. Now let's try to pretend a female student having age 9. Boom. That's it. So in this video, we have discussed all about authorization in ASP.NET Core Identity with role, claim, and policy. So that's all for this video, guys. You can clone this project from the GitHub Repo link given below in video description. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't yet. Please like and share this video with your friends and colleagues so that they can also benefit from this. See you in the next video.